Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final group presentation week of Introduction to Urban Planning. Um, Before we start with the group presentation and discussion, um, I'd like to remind you that next week we will be entering the mid semester evaluation or the mid semester exams, evaluasi tengah semester, and one of the prerequisites or the requirements for the mid-semester exams is a proof of vaccine, I think, um, because ITS is planning a roadmap to recovery of some sorts. So um, hopefully we will come back to normal class pretty soon. That's why I think they're asking for people's proof of vaccine. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure entirely on how that's managed. Um, I think you can find a link or a button to do so in Classroom. Excuse me. Sorry. Hey, sorry about that. Um, Wait, where was I? Proof of vaccine. Okay, well, apart from that, I don't really have any other announcements. Um, Please do mark your attendance um, for this class, and this week we will be discussing uh, approaches to approaches to urban planning or approaches to spatial planning. Uh, Now, some of you might be asking, as the presenting group did, what approaches to urban planning is. Well, what we mean by approach atau pendekatan usually refers to strategy and or urban planning techniques. So, what sort of techniques are they? I will leave it up to Group 5 to present it with us and see if we can come up with any points of discussion. Are the presenting group ready?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Well, I have allowed screen sharing. I have allowed for screen sharing. So um, when you're ready, the screen and time is yours.
Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In this morning, me and my partner Rizky will discuss about approaches to spatial planning. The definition: regional or spatial planning gives geographical expression to the economic, social, cultural, and ecological policies of a society. Spatial planning is used by government to manage the development of land within their jurisdiction. It is the systematic assessment of land and water potential, alternatives for land and water use, and economic and social conditions in order to select and adopt the best land use options. In practice, however, spatial planning is often confronted with the following four main problems for which CAA may provide a solution.
Advocacy planning. Advocacy planning is a theory of urban planning formulated in the 1960s by Paul Davidoff and Linda Stone Davidoff. It is a pluralistic and inclusive planning theory in which planners seek to represent the interests of various groups in society. Davidoff is a lawyer and professional who believes that planning methods are needed to help low-income groups and minorities who are not always on par with the rich and powerful. With the end of the World Wars, there was a need for social and economic reconstruction. The government was given the task of rebuilding the cities affected by the ravages of war. With the emergence of technocratic experts, they are invited to design and plan cities in a scientific, logistical, and rigorous way that will produce the best results for all stakeholders. This disconnected and elitist approach led to the government's constant failure to meet the needs of its citizens and was hit back, giving rise to alternative planning practices. Davidoff understands that not all stakeholders are represented and involved equally in the planning process, leaving groups with low socioeconomic status vulnerable to the interests of larger public institutions or private companies. Without adequate protection and care, the concerns and opinions of these individuals are left unheard and unaccounted for when developing plans. Davidoff realized that it was necessary to implement a humanistic, grassroots, and pluralistic system in which planners would advocate for the interests of the oppressed and powerless. Next. Equity planning. Equity planning is a framework in which urban planners working within government use their research, analytical, and organizational skill to influence opinion, mobilize underrepresented constituencies, and promote or implement policies and programs that redistribute public and private resources to the poor and the working class. Krumholtz, Koger, and Lin present a less common case of practitioner-written theory crossing into mainstream academic theory. They took a case study in Cleveland. There they have shifted the focus of planning, of development management to greater equity measures. This provides expanded opportunities for the urban poor in a period of changing urban economic situations. Herbert Gans sees the case study in Cleveland as an example of change in planning in America. The change takes the form of advocating for decisions that create redistribution in order to reduce the social costs of urban life to those who feel this burden the most. Next.
The next is rational comprehensive planning. Comprehensive rational planning was the main planning model for a long time. This model is based on instrumental rationale for analyzing and making decisions. The main characters of rational comprehensive planning is as a rational tool to safeguard the public interest, and second, guiding the society into the long-term future they wanted to. And these are the operational procedure framework of rational comprehensive planning. The first one is formulate goals and objectives. Second, develop and examine all the alternatives that may be open to the decision maker to achieve the goals and objectives set. Third, predict all derivative consequences of using each alternative. Fourth, compare consequences with agreed goals and objectives. Fifth, choose an alternative whose consequences are in accordance with the goals and objectives. Six, implement preferred alternatives. And the last, monitor, and evaluate the result. The strength of rational comprehensive planning is the comprehensive rational model has advantage, among which approach lays out a logical and deliberative framework for planning practice. This includes identifying specific problems, setting goals, articulating goals and objectives, predicting and projecting outcomes, testing and implementing action plans. This model also considers various alternatives that ensure that only the best action plans are selected and implemented. The weakness of rational comprehensive planning. There are undesirable ethical effects because planning is seen as an objective activity without community participation, so it cannot be considered ethically correct. There are undesirable environmental effects and no successful achievement because local knowledge and practices are not included in the planning. The measures are not adapted to specific conditions. The population does not support the desired measure from the government, and there is no interagency cooperation jurisdiction in this planning model. The last one is there are doubts about objectivity and rationale because the data are not always available and difficult to analyze, and the background of the planner is not always known. The next is disjointed incremental approach and mixed scanning approach. Disjointed incremental planning is the most widely noted alternative model for comprehensive rational planning. This model is based on bounded rationality. One of the advocates was Charles Lindblom, who wrote the famous modeling through. This result refers to the essence of this planning model. Planning is considered to lack a scientific technique that follows concrete steps, but rather a mixture of intuition and experience in reality. This planning model describes actual daily life in the planning office rather than comprehensive rational model.
Communicative approaches. Communicative planning is an urban planning approach that brings together stakeholders and engage them in a process to make joint decisions in a way that respects the positions of all parties involved. Communicative planning is often referred to as collaborative planning among planning practitioners or the collaborative planning model. Since the 1970s, communicative planning theory has been based on several key insights. These key points include the notion that communication and reasoning come in various forms. Knowledge is socially constructed, and people's diverse interests and preferences are shaped by social context. Communicative planning theory recognizes that the planner actions, words, life experiences, and communication style have an effect on the planning process facilitated by the planner. Communicative planning theory puts forward the idea that planning occurs in everyday practices and social relationships, and consensus building can be used to organize people's minds and move beyond traditional ways of knowing and making decisions. In the communicative planning process, planning practitioners play more of a facilitative role. They often act as knowledge mediators to help reframe problems, to promote more creative thinking about alternative solutions. During this process, information must be generated collectively by all stakeholders who may be affected by the outcome of the process. Next. The last one is transactive approaches. According to Friedman and Bird, the transactive planning is a response to the communication gap between technical planners and clients. To close this gap, a continuous series of personal transactions, and especially verbal transactions between planners and clients, is urgently needed. Friedman also points out that the growth of the technocrats of our society requires a decision-making method based on a shared learning process. Transactive planning allows the planner to learn experimental knowledge from the client, while the client learns technical knowledge from the planner. Through this process too, the two kinds of knowledge will each change by itself, and then these do not these two kinds of knowledge will merge into one. When the knowledge of both parties fuses, the perceptions and images of one party towards the other will change, and then the behavior of both will change. Next. Yeah, it's all from us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for for that wonderful presentation. Um, before I express my comments and a few questions that I have, I'd like to give the opportunity to your peers. So, if anybody in the class, does anybody have any questions or comments for the group? If you do, you can unmute yourself immediately. No? Okay. Well, you've given us some definitions, and you've also introduced the pros and the cons of each technique or each approach. Unfortunately, I was wondering, do you have any examples of the application of the approaches that you talked about? Let's say how do you apply advocacy planning, for example, or how do you apply disjointed? Um, how is its application? How it's its real world application? How is its application in practice? Do you have any comments?
Okay, sir. Sorry beforehand because we found difficult to search for examples and not all the approach we found on the journal.
Okay, no, I completely understand that some approaches or that some approaches are more difficult to find. Um, are more Some approaches are more difficult to find evidence in practice and such. But and while some are not. For example, strategic planning and rational comprehensive planning. I think these two techniques are perhaps or arguably the most common techniques. That the most common techniques applied worldwide. So I'm sure you can find samples or samples of places, examples of places who use rational comprehensive planning and strategic planning, for example. Or perhaps you can even ask yourselves, do we use rational comprehensive planning? Do we use strategic planning in Indonesia? I know for one thing that every unit of the government or of every unit or every department in the government structure that has something to do with spatial planning. For example, the public works, the department of housing and such. They have strategic plans, rencana strategis, or another word for it would be Renstra, to abbreviate it. So strategic planning is something that we use actually, and just a few days ago, I was asked by a friend who happens to be working with the Jakarta government to provide input for their strategic plans, on the Jakarta coastal areas, for example. They have a strategic plan, and rational comprehensive planning. As you mentioned, rational planning is the way we try to rationalize spatial planning by collecting data, analyzing the data, and then trying to draw conclusions from that, from the analytical process, and thus the results as a result of that is the spatial plan. So, do you have any examples to show us? Examples of practice to show us, or does anybody in the class have any examples that they might have found while the group was presenting? You might have been browsing in the background. Anybody? Okay, while we wait for other while we wait for any other input or any other comments from the class, I'd like to address your attention to this. Now I know that this is introduction to urban and regional planning, but when we talk about planning approaches, we don't just we don't just talk about physical planning. There are also other aspects to that. For example, advocacy planning. Advocacy planning. This is a really simple way to view advocacy planning, for example. So this is not exactly a spatial plan, but advocacy planning or advocacy plan is something that you would develop when you engage the community. When do you engage the community? You will engage the community or certain layers of the community when you conduct when you conduct the spatial planning process. For example, when you collect data to prepare for the analytical process, when you once you've done your analysis, you present your results. You present your results to the public, to the community, to the society, and then you will gather their input on how to best solve problems, solve issues, and how to best approach your plans. So advocacy planning is more geared towards community development, community engagement, and the like. Now, community development, pengembangan masyarakat, is something that you will learn. It is one of the compulsory courses, I think, in semester 6. So, but before you go there, this is an overview. This is an illustration of what advocacy planning looks like. So, the National Council for the Social Studies proposed a 10-step approach or 10-step process to advocacy planning. But whichever way you look at it, I think advocacy planning, or let's just say advocacy, involves identifying a challenge or identifying an issue, identifying a problem, and then once you have identified your problems, you will then have a look at your key stakeholders. If your screen is too small, I'll zoom in for you. So your key stakeholders or key audiences. In this case, the challenge is to convince the school board to provide adequate time for social studies instruction and professional development. In our case, the advocacy challenge would probably be something spatially related. For example, to convince or to try and provide ideal sanitation in slum communities, for example. Provide adequate slum sanitation or adequate sanitation in slum communities. So if you're talking about slum communities, then your key audiences would be the social services, dinas sosial, and then of course the slum dwellers, warga setempat, and then other layers of society that may be involved or may have a stake in that issue. For example, you may not only target the slum community, but you would also target the other communities that surround the slum communities and such. So this is just a sample. Once you've determined your stakeholders, you find out what they know, find out how they receive their information, and then you set out measurable objectives, message points, communication activities, resources, and such. So finally, once you've determined a timeline, how long should this project be, and then you can determine the final step in the 10-step process is to establish mechanisms of evaluation. So that's a sample of how advocacy planning would look like. So what you might think why I'm referring to the National Council for Social Studies to give you an overview advocacy planning? Well, because urban planning or spatial planning, let's just call it, spatial planning does not only entail the physical aspects of a city, region, or a place, but we must also consider the non-physical aspects of it, or the non-built, non-constructed aspects of it, like the human aspect and the environmental aspect, and then other intangible aspects such as the economy, perhaps even public health, and so on. So that's an example. That was an example of advocacy planning. And the other approaches were things like disjointed incremental approach, mixed scanning. The disjointed and mixed scanning approach is something that is perhaps not too common. But and yes, I would understand if you had issues in finding out in finding examples of application or practice. So does anybody have any questions or comments? Yes, Rajit.
Hello, sir. I have a question. Or I still don't understand what is disjointed incremental approach and the mixed scanning approach.
Okay, thank you. Can I have group 5 to display the disjointed approach slide, please? Okay. The disjointed incremental approach is actually it's actually a fancy way of saying that it is a fancy way of saying that it is an approach that involves an approach that involves an approach that mixes that mixes rational planning and a bit of advocacy planning. It is not so. It is actually not the definition of it. The definition of disjointed incremental approach and mixed scanning approach is not exactly clear, but the idea is the idea of disjointed incremental approach is this approach, disjointed and mixed scanning approach, is usually used is usually used when you are trying to facilitate rural development, for example, in remote communities. Why is that? Because most of the times, if you go into the deep rural areas, deep rural community, and engage with rural communities who may not have exposure who may not have had exposure to spatial planning and such, then this disjointed incremental approach and or mixed scanning approach is usually employed. So first of all, you would need to employ advocacy. You would need to employ an advocacy approach to gain the people's trust. Once you have gained their trust, then you can initiate the rational planning process. And most of the times in remote rural communities, the rational and the advocacy approaches, or the rational and the advocacy strategies, have to go hand in hand. So you might have to switch from one approach to another as the process goes, because you may need to advocate first, and then you employ the rational planning process. And once the rational planning process goes, then as the rational planning process goes, there may be some you may run into issues with the local communities, for example, because they may not fully understand what you're doing. So they may begin to question again, why are you doing this? You have to return to advocacy again. For example, when a few years ago, when I was tasked to develop plans for a remote community deep in northeastern Kalimantan. No, not for the new capital, but for something else. Deep inside northeastern Kalimantan, where we had to engage the community, telling them that okay, first of all, your town, your settlement has been designated by the provincial government as a new hub or a new node for development. And okay, as a new node for development. So kabupatennya itu kena pemekaran. That's the idea. So we had to explain to the community, what does pemekaran means? Apa sih artinya pemekaran itu? Advocacy planning. We have to explain to them first. We have to explain. We have to engage the community and ask them, what do you think of it? What do you think that means? And then try to bridge the knowledge gap. So they think that pemekaran is A, and the textbook definition of pemekaran is maybe B. So we try to bridge the gap between A and B. Once that's done, then once we establish a firm understanding of what pemekaran is, we explain to them again. We advocate to them again. This is what will happen to your village once this status has been attained. Setelah pemekaran, biasanya akan berubah. Your village will change, will transform. How will it transform? What effects does it have on you? And so on and so on and so on. So we spent a few months advocating change. As a matter of fact, getting people to understand what this whole planning process is, because they were so remote and their settlements, their village, evolved organically. They didn't have spatial planning. If there's a plot of land, if there's an empty plot of land, they'll build there. They'll build their houses there and so on. And they have a very traditional approach to building. So we're trying. So we were trying to accommodate, one, the provincial government's interests, and two, we try to accommodate the local people's interests as well, and try not to disrupt their local values and traditions. So that's what advocacy planning is. Once all of that is done, everybody agrees that okay, pemekaran is good for you, then we start the rational planning process. We start to identify the potential places for development. First we established where the administrative borders are. Once we know the physical scope of planning, we then start to identify, okay, when a village, desa, is elevated to a regency, kabupaten, what do they need? What facilities do they need? What sort of basic services do they need? Does the current village have these basic services? And if they have these basic services, what sort of level of service do they provide? For example, health services. A regency or a kabupaten may need to have a class C or a class B hospital to support the hospital and or other health facilities to support their regency or to support their community. Does the village have it? They have a health facility, but it was more of a clinic, puskesmas. It's not going to be able to serve. A whole region. So we need to provide adequate health facilities. We need to add. Of course, development will attract people, and the in-migration of people will then attract other challenges, such as, for example, security. Security. Do they have police stations? Do they have fire stations? Do they have this and that? So we were planning all of that in a village of, a few thousand people, and that village happens to be 90% forest area. So they had almost no roads. So we were trudging on dirt most of the time, and when we tried to pinpoint the locations for each and every function or each and every area for development, first we rode trail bikes, off-road motorcycles, but then the forest would get too thick that we had to continue on foot. So that was the situation that we had to face, and that was an extended illustration of how advocacy and rational planning come together to form this sort of incremental approach. And it's called disjointed because as we move along, as we go deeper into the woods, we didn't discover, but we found there were other settlements. There were other settlements in there, and then there were other people living in the woods, and so we had to repeat the advocacy planning again. We had to explain again what we were doing, and why we were there, and what it would mean, for the community. So I think that is my best attempt to explain and give you an example of what disjointed incremental approach looks like. But it's generally an interplay of two different approaches at the same time. hope that answers your question.
Thank you, sir.
No worries. Any other questions or comments, perhaps? Yes, Indira.
I'd like to ask a question, sir. Previously, Group 5 mentioned about transactive approaches towards planning approaches. And when you presented about advocacy planning, I read that the method was using interviews and asking opinions. So is advocacy planning counted as a transactive approach or another approach?
Okay. Can I have the slide for transactive approach, please? Transact or transactive? Okay. Advocacy planning can be considered as a transactive approach because it is in fact a sort of transaction between multiple parties. So with advocacy, as I mentioned, it's more it is usually used to deal with intangible aspects of spatial planning. So if there's an issue within the community, then you would use an advocacy approach. Another example, I'll give you an example of a transactive slash advocacy approach. I might have told you this before. I might have shared this story with you before of a housing and settlement project that the department and I were involved in. More specifically, it's the urban planning and design laboratory that we're involved in. So the background of the case was that in Sumeneb, Madura, they had an issue with real estate development, private real estate development, large scale private development. So real estate development. On the other hand, they also have private development at a much smaller scale. For example, if you happen to be a landowner, you have 1 or 2 plots of land, and you decide to build, then you would be considered as a private. Developer. So what sort of advocacy approach did we use? We organized a focus group discussion that and we invited large scale private developers, so the real estate developers, real estate groups. We invited community leaders. We invited community leaders from the local kelurahan, kecamatan, and the local village heads, village leaders, and we also invited other relevant stakeholders from the public works, from housing, and from the Department of Housing. And Pertanahan, or the apa ya? Anyways, Dinas Pertanahan juga diundang, and so we had a good mix of stakeholders, and the idea was first to determine what real estate development would be. Like I said, if you had 1 or 2 plots of land and you decide to build these 2 plots of land, would that be called real estate development? If you had 5 plots of land, would you call that real estate development? And so on. And so the first thing we needed to do was to determine what real estate development was. And once we did, once we did that, we were tasked to determine whether one form of traditional housing in Madura should be considered as real estate development, or would that be considered as something else? For your information, there is a form of traditional housing, or traditional settlement, should I say, in Madura called Tanian Lanjeng, that forms a cluster of houses. And so if you were to develop, or if you were to build such settlement, Tanian Lanjeng, would that be considered as real estate development? So that sort of thing we were exploring. I know it may sound silly. It's a traditional settlement. Why would you call that real estate development? But the problem was the government said, okay, if you build more than 3 houses, we'll consider that real estate development. No, because in Tanian Lanjeng you might develop more than 3 houses to accommodate your extended family. And so that wasn't fair to them. That was traditional housing, and you impose real estate development tax for them, and so on and such. So there was a big argument. Just to determine what real estate development is. And so finally, we came to a conclusion. Real estate development should be any kind of multi-dwelling development, other than traditional settlements, that includes the provision of basic services, basic infrastructure such as road network, utilities, And this is the final and most important point, I think, that real estate development is profit-oriented. So anything that is anything that is multi-unit, and so on and so on and so on. And in the end, we said we added this one keyword, which is profit-oriented, which is profit. So profit-oriented, anything that is profit-oriented. So if you build multiple houses and you're providing basic services, and you're selling them again, not for your personal use, that's real estate development. So the idea of that, the idea of this focus group discussion, or another thing about this focus group discussion, or the background of this focus group discussion, is that the local government of Sumeneb was having problems integrating this development, these large-scale real estate development, into their spatial plans, because they didn't have any regulatory frameworks for it. And so we needed to come to an agreement. What's transactive about that focus group discussion process was that there were compromises to be made. The local government or each party, each stakeholder then said, okay, well, from the regulatory framework that we're trying to create, I'm going to lose some. But on the other hand, I will I will gain other things. So it's a win-win. It's a win-win situation. We try to make sure that nobody is losing too much, and trying to make sure that the other parties or the other stakeholders does not gain too much advantage. So that's what a transactive approach is. So yes, advocacy planning can be considered as a transactive approach, and the process involves not so much as spatial analysis or any others rational analysis processes. It's more communicative. It's more qualitative. It's more qualitative approaches, and so it may not sound like spatial planning, but you wouldn't believe how much these transactive processes actually influence spatial planning. In fact, I would argue that transactive processes actually makes up or has a much stronger influence compared to rational spatial planning. You can talk about geographical characteristics all day long. You can talk about economic data all day long, but in the end, if one stakeholder or two has too much to lose in the spatial planning process, then they would advocate for a more transactive approach. Then they would argue. Then all of those numbers, no matter how good they look, no matter how good an analysis you present to these people, they would say, "Nah, I've got too much to lose. I don't care about your numbers. Do something about it." So that's how influential transactive approaches are to spatial planning. And you also need to keep in mind that spatial planning is usually, not all the time, but most of the time, spatial planning is very politically charged. So there's a lot of politics in it as well. And politics is transactions. Easy. It's as easy as that, I think. I hope that extended illustration helps to clear some questions from Indira. Otherwise, if that raises more questions from you, from anyone in the class, then that's good. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Yes, Reza or Rizky, should I call you?
Reza, sir. I'd like to ask, knowing that you're much more experienced than us in the process of planning, I'd like to ask a perspective on how should a planner take approach of an issue or a community, knowing that the approach that the Group 5 have provided, do we pick a type of approach that is suitable for the community, or do we need to take strengths and of many approaches and make a combination of it? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Reza. I was waiting for that question. I thought if nobody asks about this, then I'm going to ask myself. Yes. How do we determine the best approach the best approach or the best strategy to engage with the community, or sorry, how do we determine the best approach for planning in an area? First of all, when you're engaging with the community, you need to remember that every community is unique. They have their own. They have different characters. They have different habits. They have different ways of life, and so there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach or one-size-fits-all strategy. You can't just pick. You can't just pick. I'm going to do this, and then everybody else should follow. No, that's not democracy. That's dictatorship. You can do that in North Korea, but not here, I suppose. But so you need to understand the context, not just the geographical context, but also the social context, the social context of the area that you're planning. Engage with the community, talk to them. What do they want? First of all, what do they want? What do they need? So before you start presenting your plans or presenting your ideas, listen to them first. Listen to them first, because that's the key. Because that's the key to any successful planning, in my opinion, and that people, the general society, are actually the key drivers to development. So listen to them first, and once you've gathered that, then you start to present your alternatives, not your idea, but your alternatives. So if the government were to do this, how would you feel? If the government were to do that, what do you think? If the government would do these, what do you think? How do you think it will impact you as an individual, as a community, and so on and so on? So there is no way of determining which strategy is best used to engage with the community or to plan. But no, I think to plan is to plan something physically, to plan a city, to plan a town is easy. You just need to determine what the city needs or what the village needs, and then you plot them out. You plot them out on a map. This is where this should go. This is where this should go. This is where that should go. There is a rational analytical process to determine what goes where, and that's easy. You can just crunch the numbers. You can overlay the maps and so on, and you get your result. But to get people to understand, to get people to support your plan, that's something else entirely. Because when you say, I should put a hospital there, and then you find out that, oh, hang on, people actually live in that area. How would they feel if you tell them, pick up your things, we'll bulldoze your house and we'll build a hospital there? So when you add society to the mix, then spatial planning becomes a bit more muddled, so to say. That's where transactive approaches come. So you need to advocate healthy living to these people. You need to say that you need to tell them that we need this hospital, and our analysis shows that this is the best location for the hospital, and so we need to destroy your house. But before we destroy your house, we would like to offer you in exchange, I don't know, another house maybe, or we would like to facilitate your move, and so on and so on. So that's a sort of situation that we normally deal with, because it's not every day that we get a blank canvas to build on. Most of the times when we talk about planning, spatial development, then the area that we're going to develop, then the area that we're going to build on is usually already populated with people, or it's already half built and so on. So there is no straight way, or I don't think there is a technique to determine which approach is best. But the general rule of thumb is that you listen to the people, you understand the social, economic, and ecological context of an area, and then you determine which is best to deal with this mix of factors, or mix of drivers, mix of and just understand the general context. Just the other day, I was approached by the Australian Natural Hazard Research Centre, and they gave me a copy of their research priorities, and they asked me to provide them feedback to their discussion papers. And in one of the research priorities, I noticed they were talking about resilient communities, and one of the things that they highlighted in bold was communities are different. There is no each community is different. They have their different characteristics, and therefore there is no one size fits all approach. All the other ones are not were not highlighted or anything, but their emphasis was that their emphasis was that you can do all the spatial planning you want, you can do all the rational planning you want, but at the end of the day, you need to engage the community, and communities are different, and so you need different strategies to engage with them. In the Australian context, then the First Nations or the Aboriginal people have a different trait, have different interests, have different priorities than the migrant communities, for example. So in Indonesia, maybe from Sabang until Merauke, you will encounter many different communities. I think as an illustration, I think across our country, across the nation, we have over 700 different local languages. So if you were to take that number, 700 local dialects or local languages, then you should have 700 different strategies, or at least 700 different approaches to engaging with communities, and 700 different approaches to 700 different approaches to spatial planning, because that's just how unique communities are. And there is no way that you will have a one-size-fits-all approach to that 700 different community, and so on. So understand the broader context first. That's your best way. That's the best way to determine what strategy to use. And I will, and this sort of question, what strategy is best to use, what approach is best to use, you need to continually ask yourself these questions in other different in the other courses that you will take throughout your academic career, because from introduction to urban planning, to urban design theory, to urban planning practices, to coastal planning, to community development, you will be presented with an array of different approaches. And you need to ask yourself continuously, you need to ask your friends, you need to ask the teachers continuously, sir, ma'am, dude, what's the best approach to this? So that's a very good question, and that is a question that I hope you will continue to ask not only during your university years, but more importantly, when you go into planning practice, once you transition to a professional life, I hope you don't. I hope you will not stop asking that question. What is the best approach to planning? Or what is the best approach? What is the best strategy for this thing that we're dealing with? So thank you for that, Reza.
Thank you to you too, sir, for the great answer. Thank you, sir.
I'd like to add one little comment. Actually, I said to you, I told you that when you're doing spatial planning, for or developmental planning or planning for development or whatnot, you come up with alternatives. And then you present them to people. No, sorry, rewind that. When I told you that story about developing a rural community, because that rural community was designated for development. Kena pemekaran. I was actually hoping for one of you to ask, but isn't that kind of like a top-down approach, and not a grassroots approach? Yes, it is a top-down approach, and the way we advocate for development is actually a more top-down approach. I'm sorry to say, but sometimes planning, sometimes in planning, it's actually to. This is my perspective on it. Of course, it doesn't reflect the department's beliefs or values or whatnot. But sometimes I think that planning is a manipulative process, especially advocacy planning. It is a manipulative process because we're trying to convince people that this is good for you. So you're trying to sell the idea of development. And so in that sense, there is another question that I need you to ask yourself continuously for the rest of your life. Whenever you're involved in any project that says that this is planning for development, this is for developing a region, I need you all to ask yourselves one question: who is this development for? Okay, you're planning for development. Okay, you're planning for. Don't ask yourself what are we developing, but ask yourselves, who is this development for? If you can't find the answer to that, then ask the project owner, ask your peers, ask the government. Excuse me, sir, ma'am, dude. Who is this development for? And hopefully they can come up with a good answer for that. Because come to think of it, what we did advocating for development in a rural community. Well, you know what? Maybe these people would like to be left alone. Maybe they don't want to develop that fast. Maybe that accelerated development would endanger them. Maybe that accelerated development is good for the region, but are you willing to sacrifice? Are you willing to sacrifice the needs of a certain group of people to accommodate the projected needs or the needs of others? So, who is this development for? I think that is the most valuable question that you can ask yourself and ask the authorities and ask any other stakeholders that are involved. Yeah, that's my final comment on that. So, anybody else have any questions or comments regarding what I just said? The key takeaway is that yes, advocacy planning can be a bit manipulative, but I'm sure that if you can spin that to good use, then I think that would justify the means. No, that didn't come out right. Anyways, yeah. Any further comments or questions? Any further discussions? If not, then unfortunately, I have been called to several meetings actually, and I think I'd like to thank the presenting group, Group 5, for introducing the different approaches to spatial planning, or different approaches to planning, to us today. Hopefully, our discussion has led you to learn a thing or two. Okay, I'd like Group 5 to close this session for the day before we finally end our meeting.
Thank you for all your attentions and sorry for the inconvenience. Good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
You don't need to apologize for any inconvenience. I don't think any of us were inconvenienced. I wasn't. So, okay, great. Thank you again, Group 5, and thank you everyone for your undivided attention. And thank you for joining me this morning, and thank you very much for your undivided attention. Next week we will have mid-semester evaluations. And as I mentioned, there is a verification link or so for you to confirm whether you had your first or second shot of vaccine. It has become a prerequisite or a requirement to take these mid-semester exams. Most of the exams, at least in our department, are conducted online anyway, so I don't really know what the urgency is, but just do that. And I hope you all, I wish you all a great day and take care. I will provide you with announcements regarding to the mid-semester exams and their mechanisms soon. So take care, everyone. Have a great day. Good morning. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.